What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I jump in, as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. There's only one place to start today's show. First segment is going to be dedicated exclusively to what happened in Manchester between Manchester City and Arsenal. And then second half of the show or second segment, going to look at kind of the other midweek news and notes. U.S. Soccer has a new sporting director, more Premier League action to discuss quickly. Burnley have won the championship. There was a big Coppa Italia semi-final second leg. All of that good stuff coming up in the second part of the show. Like I said, though, only one place to start. That is Manchester City Arsenal. Before I get into the game itself, I want to make sure this is put in the proper context. This was not so much a title decider as it was a last hope for Arsenal. Because you can't build a pathway to a title assuming you're going to take points, and particularly all three, in this game if you're Arsenal. Where this fell off the rails for Arsenal were those last three games, and specifically the Southampton one. Because I was adamant before that the situation hadn't really changed all that much. Then you go drop points. You have to rescue a point against the worst team in the league at home in your final game before this one. And so now all of a sudden, your lead is almost gone. City still have these two games in hand. And even if you would have gotten a draw here, you still wouldn't have been able to control much. But it would have been helpful to at least give yourself a cushion that City, and knowing that City do have to go get the points. And now you're in a situation where City can stumble a little bit and still win because their maximum point value is so much higher. But it was not about this game. And you could tell that from the opening whistle because Arsenal just looked like they knew they had lost their chance at winning the title. They just had nothing to offer for the most part. So yes, could they have gotten this back on track with a win and completely changed the conversation here? Absolutely. But you're hoping you do something against the odds there. It's not part of a logical pathway to winning this title. Beating Southampton was. Getting more than 3 points from those last three games was. That's where this got lost. The question was, can they somehow miraculously stop this snowball? And the answer was quite clearly no. Before the goals even started coming in, Arsenal are giving it away. Thomas Partey steps across De Bruyne. Certainly could have been a penalty. For me, this is where I like VAR to just do what VAR is supposed to do. It's not a clear and obvious error. I would have gone with whatever the referee on the field gave, and that's what happened. Was it more of a penalty than not? I would concede that, but it's not something you would completely want to redo. No issue with it. And obviously, it didn't impact anything, so it's not really a talking point. That was before the goal started coming in, though. And then De Bruyne gets the opener. Haaland holds the ball up, lays it off to him. De Bruyne was sensational in this game, and I want to say this again. I bring it up every once in a while. The fact that he hasn't had more success in Ballon d'Or voting, the fact that he's just far and away the best midfielder in the world. And I do think that he and Haaland are the two guys who you can kind of pull out of this Manchester City machine, and it changes things. You can rotate the wingers, you can rotate the center backs, the outside backs. De Bruyne is the one guy, and of course they can survive without him. But there is nobody on this team to replace him because there's not a player in the world to replace him that does what he does. And you saw it in this game. He was sensational. The other part of this story was that Thomas Partey and that Arsenal midfield had no clue how to prevent him from just running at them and finding all kinds of space. From a tactical standpoint, that was the story of this game. Arsenal got overran in the midfield. Partey was... I don't want to bash him too badly, but he had a really, really rough game. He was awful. And so now all of a sudden, they're having to make... Ben White has a key block. De Bruyne almost scored again there. Then you get the John Stones goal, which VAR overturns to give City a 2-0 lead. De Bruyne adds a third, and it's kind of over at that point, even though it felt like it was over from pretty much goal one. And I am going to bounce a little bit between Arsenal and City here because I want to finish talking about the game before I start talking about the ramifications. This Arsenal team was hanging with Manchester City, was ahead of Manchester City, in large part because those depth pieces were delivering. Nketiah, even that goal that Jorginho scored, Reece Nelson, Trossard. You had more than just your preferred 11 who were making significant contributions to this. Now you're looking at it. All of your strikers, including Gabriel Jesus, the goals have dried up. You don't have William Saliba, who's your best defender, and you don't have somebody capable of replacing him, in large part because you don't have a right back at this point, because Tomiyasu was your one option there outside of Ben White, who Arteta didn't seem to trust that much anyway, and so Ben White needs to play right back. I feel fine about a Gabriel Ben White center back pairing. The problem is you don't have anybody to play a right back. So they had some cover, and then you had two injuries in your defense, and all of a sudden they're really thin. And Rob Holding has to play because that's the best way to organize your back four at this point. And then there's the midfield. Because you do have some options up front. I'm not worried about that attack. I don't have much criticism for that attack. I believe in Martinelli. I believe in Saka. Obviously, they could probably use with an upgraded striker, although I'm also okay giving Jesus a little more time to get back into the swing of things. But you got two foundational pieces in your two wingers. And Trossard, I was all about that signing, and he's proven me right. As good as this midfield has been, and they've been excellent this season, you are still talking about Granit Xhaka being part of that midfield, and there just is this part of me that has a hard time envisioning that trio being good enough to win a Premier League, being good enough to perform at the level they need to over 38 games. And Odegaard's been sensational. Partey has been phenomenal at times. But now Partey is just in this really, really bad stretch of form where he has been poor multiple games. And Xhaka isn't giving you all that much. And so you're kind of relying on Odegaard to carry the entire midfield. And he doesn't do the defensive stuff, which is where you need more than him. This really is about the other two, not so much about Odegaard. You compare that to what City have, to what, Chelsea in theory have, to what Newcastle are building, to what Manchester United have. That's the better example. In a Bruno Fernandes, Casemiro, Christian Eriksen midfield trio. And I just sat there during this game feeling like there needed to be an upgrade in that midfield, and an upgrade in that midfield specifically in the form of Declan Rice. Declan Rice would do wonders for this team to give you another option, more depth, and to me, a better overall player. So I'll be really curious to see if Arsenal go that direction this summer. Can they land him? Because that is the next step here if they're going to find a way to go compete for a title again. If they're going to find a way to hang with the Manchester clubs, the Newcastles, whatever version of Chelsea eventually shows up. Their depth was good. It just wasn't good enough for long enough. And they eventually also got hurt in the positions where they didn't have as much depth. Because the guys that I mentioned that delivered, most of those guys are playing in the attack. And now you've got a midfielder who's having a tough time, and Kevin De Bruyne had a field day. So that was the one tactical thing I wanted to talk about for a little bit. Going to the Manchester City side of this moving forward. It is maybe ironic is the word, that in this season where I have been so critical of Manchester City, where Manchester City I still believe have been overall disappointing, that we are talking about a very real scenario in which they win a treble. Clearly the favorites in the Premier League now. You've got a Manchester derby to win the FA Cup. And while derby games are always difficult, they're the clear favorites in that one too. And then you got the Champions League. You got to get through Real Madrid. You got to win another game after that. But they're the favorites to win that competition as well. And if they get past Real Madrid, they will have gotten to a domestic cup final, hypothetically have won the Premier League, and gotten to a Champions League final in the same season. That's something that Pep Guardiola has never done in Manchester City. You can make a case that this is, or could be, if they finish it out, the most successful season in terms of end result of the Pep Guardiola era. And that's a fascinating conversation to have because you never would have thought that most of this season. But here we are. And then on the Arsenal side of this, I don't see a way back. So I'm going to give this speech at least once. And I'm going to give it now. There is a difference between a season being a failure and a season being a disappointment. And here is the difference. Seasons that are failures have to do with not living up to expectations. Disappointments are more circumstantial. You cannot call a season a failure in which any Arsenal fan would have celebrated qualifying for the top four and getting back to the Champions League, which, by the way, they have done, thanks to Brighton's loss today, and say it's a failure. You can't. Can you say it's a huge disappointment because of how close they were in the lead they had and the potential to win a title when you have no idea when that opportunity is going to present itself again? Absolutely. I'm not going to sit here and frame this as Arsenal have nothing to be disappointed in. City were just better at the end of the day. No. They gave themselves all the cushion they needed. They made this game irrelevant until they made it relevant again. Because this loss wouldn't have mattered if they would have taken care of business over the past couple weeks. And it wouldn't have mattered as much had they not had that other slump that they fell into. But they're not the same thing. They are not the same thing. You have to separate the two. It's absolutely disappointing. You will come away from this season feeling like it could have been more. That is absolutely valid. That doesn't mean that it was a failure. That you can't be satisfied with the progress that was made, because this was a huge step forward for Arsenal. We are talking about Arsenal completely differently because of what they did this season, even though they're probably not going to win the league. It's winning is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. If this team would have found a way to survive this and somehow hold on, they would have skipped a step. Now, the other part of this is when you're dealing with Manchester City, when you're dealing with Newcastle money, when you're dealing with Chelsea money, it's not always this linear thing where eventually you get there. They may never be in this position again in the next decade. That's what makes these moments so difficult to swallow when you're watching this fade away. But if you're ever going to get to that mountaintop, you also have to learn how to navigate it. And you got to learn from the mistakes along the way, learn from the disappointments. They let top four slip away last season. They got better from it. They were more consistent this season. And now they're going to play in the Champions League. Time will tell if they can actually take that next step. But disappointment, failure, not the same thing. I would classify this season as a disappointment for Arsenal because of what the opportunity they gave themselves. Just don't call it a failure. Because a failure means you're not living up to what realistic expectations were. And you can maybe have a conversation that it would be realistic to expect Arsenal to win with the lead they had. But you can't sit here and say that at the same time everybody's saying it's Manchester City, it's inevitable. Those two things don't connect. So yes, Arsenal did throw this away to a certain extent, and Manchester City kept the pressure up and really ramped up the pressure in these final, this last month or so. But Chelsea's season is a failure. Tottenham's season is a failure. Liverpool's season is a failure. You can't lump Arsenal's season in with those teams. It goes back to expectations. Disappointment? Sure. Failure? No way.